Hello, 8th graders. So today's video will be the last one for Chapter 8. We are going to discuss the end of the Civil War. That is 8.6 in your textbook. If you want to follow along with me while I go through the section, you can start on page 478 and follow along with me that way. Okay, again, I'm assuming you've already read it. I'm just going to kind of go through it like I normally do in class, where I ask a few questions and kind of do that discussion thing like we've been doing this entire time. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is the siege of Vicksburg. So coming into this part of the war, remember the South had just two major victories, okay, at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, both of which are in Virginia. The South had beaten the Union's army pretty handily under the leadership of Robert E. Lee. Okay, so the South is in a pretty good position as far as things go at this time. Their spirits are very good. They're winning battles, that type of thing. On the other hand, the Union is the exact opposite. People are starting to wonder if Lincoln is leading the war right. Things aren't going very well. Should we really be doing this? That type of thing, because they are losing some really big battles. Okay. However, that all starts to change here really shortly. Vicksburg is, remember, well, you don't know where Vicksburg is. Vicksburg is in Mississippi. Okay, it's on the Mississippi River. Now, what I wanted to say before is that we talked about earlier how the North actually controlled both ends of the southern Mississippi. So they were in Memphis, Tennessee, and not Jackson, Mississippi, but at the bottom, the port of Louisiana, okay? New Orleans. So they had both ends of the southern Mississippi covered. However, remember misspoke. Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana are on the other side of the western side of the Mississippi versus the rest of the southern states being on the eastern side of the Mississippi. So somehow, even though they can't use the bottom of the Mississippi River, they need to get supplies over the river in order to be able to go back and forth between those two sets of southern states that are separated by the Mississippi. Here's where Vicksburg comes in. Okay, Vicksburg is a town in Mississippi that lies up high on a cliff. It's right next to a spot that's really, really good to cross. In fact, that's where the South had crossed the river in order to get supplies from Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas to the rest of the South. Now, this battle comes, it's very difficult for the North. The North attacks them because Vicksburg is high up on a cliff, okay, over the river. So therefore, you can't attack from the river because they're on the high ground. They see you coming. They battle. They shoot a lot of people. Okay, it's not a good strategy. So Grant, who's leading this battle at the time, and Grant is rather successful as a general, decides that he has a good idea. He takes his troops up the river in the middle of the night, lands in a place that is not guarded, and then goes all the way around Vicksburg and attacks from the side that is not from the river, so from the backside of Vicksburg. This is successful because on the backside of Vicksburg, because it's on a cliff, they can't go anywhere. All right, so they have nowhere to run. Therefore, the North, actually, after quite a long battle, decides they finally take Vicksburg because of that strategy, okay? But, and that's important because now the South cannot get supplies from both halves of its states. Okay, so that's a huge loss for the South. The South now controls no part of the Mississippi River, and they can't cross back and forth or go south through it. This is really good for the North because the North now controls the entire Mississippi River, and they use it to transport a ton of supplies for themselves. Okay, so that's kind of the Battle of Vicksburg summed up for you in a few minutes. If you want to read more about it, it's on page 479. The Battle of Gettysburg, this is probably the battle in the Civil War that everybody's heard of. You've all probably heard of the name of Gettysburg because it's the most famous battle, probably. Okay, Gettysburg is located in Pennsylvania. Okay, and what happens is Robert E. Lee decides that he is going to, after winning in Virginia, march north to Pennsylvania. He's going to try and take Gettysburg. And when he does that, he wants to then try and take Washington, D.C. to the west of it. Okay? Sorry, east. Gosh, my directions are backwards. To the east of Gettysburg. Okay, so his first step is he has to go north to get to Gettysburg, which is kind of backwards from the South's plan. Remember, the South decides that they're not going to fight an offensive war. They want to play defense. If you want to fight, you have to come attack us. Well, Robert E. Lee, even though he did this once before and it didn't turn out well, decides that he wants to attack by going north into Union territory. Okay, so these soldiers march north into Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. They actually win right away. They drive the Union right out of Gettysburg, okay, and rather quickly. However, the Union goes up onto high ground. It's called Cemetery Peak, something like that. Okay, Cemetery Ridge. Okay, where they take a spot. They hunker down overnight. They make really good kind of barriers up there, so they have this ridge really solidified. Now, in the morning, Robert E. Lee decides that he's going to drive those Union soldiers off of Cemetery Ridge and win Gettysburg totally. So what he does is he sends a small offensive trying to drive those soldiers away. However, because the North has that high ground there, they easily beat Lee's offensive and they keep Cemetery Ridge because they're in really good shape up there. Okay, well, Lee, deciding that his first attack didn't work, he's like, you know what, I just need to do it better. So he makes a really bad decision. He says, we're going to do it again, and this time we're going to send 15,000 soldiers right at them. Okay, this is called Pickett's charge because Pickett was the general for the South, not the general, sorry, the commander for the South who led this part of the army. He gave Pickett 15,000 soldiers and he said, attack the middle of Cemetery Ridge. So those soldiers do. Sure enough, they start to march towards Cemetery Ridge. Now, to get there, they had to cross 1,000 yards of wide open field going uphill. Okay? Now, if you've ever kind of experienced anything walking uphill, if you're on top of the hill, you can see down the hill for a long ways. But if you're walking up the hill, you can't really see much. Okay, well, that's kind of what happens. The Union soldiers see the Southern soldiers long before they ever get to Cemetery Ridge, and they just destroy them. Okay, with the exception of a few soldiers, or a little bit of soldiers, nobody even reaches the top of Cemetery Ridge. Okay, the South gets absolutely, to use an extreme term because there's really a good word for it, they get slaughtered in this sense. Okay, what in the North ends up winning the Battle of Gettysburg because of Robert E. Lee's really bad decision to send 15,000 people right at the middle of Cemetery Ridge. Now, the reason you've all heard of Gettysburg before is that because in this battle, it was the most deadly battle, okay, during the Civil War. Over 50,000 people died during this battle. Okay, 50,000 soldiers died during the Battle of Gettysburg. That is crazy. Okay. In fact, in your book, it talks about at one point how one of the Union generals rides out over the battlefield after the battle's over, but he can't even ride his horse through the battlefield because there are so many wounded and dead soldiers laying there. Okay, so that's how many people die in this battle. And the North ends up winning it, even though obviously lots and lots of casualties on both sides, but way more on the South because of Robert E. Lee's decision. Okay. Eventually, the South loses the battle. They decide they have to retreat, so they leave Gettysburg and head back into, Confederate territory back down by Virginia. A few years later, during 1863, they actually decided to dedicate a cemetery at Gettysburg. It's still there today. It's one of the more popular spots to visit in that area. It's kind of a historical monument, obviously. Okay, to all 50,000 soldiers that died there. Okay, so that's why there's that big national cemetery there because of this horrendous battle that took place. Also during the time, Lincoln comes and gives what's called the Gettysburg Address, okay, and that's another famous speech. And when it really shouldn't be called a speech because Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, excuse me, was only about 10 sentences long. That's it. Okay, that's like half a page. Excuse me again. And in the speech, he pretty much preaches unity. He says that even though this horrendous battle took place here not long ago, we need to come together as a country. We need to end this war, and we need to come all back together. Okay, he's using this. Lincoln is preaching unity throughout his presidency. Okay, he does not want to fight this war. He's preaching that we need to stay together. We're fighting this war because we need to be a country. And the reason he's giving this speech is because he has to convince those people in the North that don't want to fight that the war needs to happen. Because remember, there's a lot of people in the North that don't want this war to be happening. So the reason he keeps preaching unity is because he needs the war to continue, but he also needs to convince those people it's necessary. All right. We're now on page 482 if you're following along. Okay, after Robert E. Lee kind of retreats back into the South, the Union forces move south following them. Okay, obviously Grant just won at Vicksburg. Okay, because he's been so impressed with them and how things are going. Remember, Abraham Lincoln's been changing leaders of the Union Army. He says that Ulysses S. Grant is my guy. He's going to lead the army and he's going to take us to the end of this war. Excuse me, I have a scratch in my throat. Okay, he's going to take us to the end of this war. So he names him leader of the Union Army. Grant fights a little bit different style of war. In fact, they call him unconditional surrender Grant because of the type of war that he fights. Okay, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. This is really the only time in American history that this type of war has been used. When Grant becomes the leader of the Union Army, he puts two people in charge of what he calls total war. Now, during a war, I'm sure you all know that the idea at this time is that soldiers are killed, okay? That's how the war is fought. The new style of war they're going to talk about, total war, is not only are soldiers killed on, the idea is to beat the other army, but you are now destroying everything. Anything that could be useful to civilians, to soldiers, to anything is destroyed. So two of the most famous ones that you're going to hear about are the March to Shiloh. Okay, and that was, I believe, by Sheridan. Yes, Sheridan goes to Shenandoah, not Shiloh, Shenandoah, which is in Virginia. And on his way there, Grant tells him to destroy everything. So they're burning trees down, they're cutting trees down, they're destroying homes, they're burning barns full of grain, they're burning fields, they're killing livestock. Okay, they are just destroying everything to get the South to quit. At the same time, he sends a man called Sherman. Okay, and you'll hear this term again. It's very famous. Sherman's March to the Sea. Sherman's March to the Sea is Grant sends him south to Georgia. He tells him to take Atlanta and then to march right to the sea and do the exact same thing. Excuse me again. He tells them, burn down trees, burn down barns, burn fields, kill livestock. Obviously beat the other army. Do all that stuff because we want the South to quit. We don't want to just beat their army. We want their civilians to say, that's it. It's over. We can't do this anymore. Okay, so the idea of total war is you are destroying everything that is useful to anybody. Okay, and obviously this is horrible for the South. How are they can't survive without food or livestock, or remember, they're farming for a living in the South at this time. So they have no animals to pull the plows, no animals to eat, no grain to feed anything. Okay, they're struggling bad. And that was what Grant wanted because he wanted the South to quit. Okay. So during this whole situation, you think, wow, the South they're just about done. They actually fight for another 2 years after this. Okay. Remember, they're fighting for their style of life. So even though life is horrendous in the South because of the way the war is being fought, they fight for another 2 years to try and save their way of life. Okay, what we're going to talk about next is President Lincoln, and we've been talking about him a lot. However, remember, presidencies only last 4 years. This war has now gone on just about 4 years. So President Lincoln is up for re-election. He figures for sure he would lose. Why? Because the war is so unpopular in the North. Nobody wants to be fighting this war, so why would you re-elect the president who started it? That's what he thinks. He's like, there's no way I'm going to win because of this. Okay, and that was the way it was going to be. However, when Sherman takes Atlanta, it looks really good for the North. They look like geniuses. Okay, and that happens right before the election. So because of that, Lincoln gets reelected. Okay, he beats McClellan, and McClellan was one of Abraham Lincoln's former leaders of the Union Army, but he was running as a Democrat for president to end the war. He didn't want to fight the war anymore. Okay. But Lincoln ends up beating him because Sherman took Atlanta and they looked like geniuses with their total war strategy. So that saved Lincoln's butt in a sense. And he becomes president for the second time. It talks about his second inaugural address in here. Again, Lincoln is preaching unity. We need to fight this war because we are staying together as one country. He's trying to convince those northern people that this war has to happen. Okay? He's got that theme going for him. On page 44 is where we're at. One more drink here. We're finally coming up on the end of the war. Okay, the North is finally starting, because of the total war, they don't have many supplies in the South. The Southern Army is starting to lose a bunch of battles because they don't have enough stuff or enough people. Okay, so they keep retreating and retreating and retreating. Eventually, okay, the Union lays siege on a town outside of Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of the South, for 9 months. They lay siege on this, okay? For 9 months, they shoot it with cannons and bombard it with artillery, okay? Eventually, after 9 months, the South retreats again, and on that same day, Richmond, which is the capital of the South, gets captured by the Union. Okay, so that's pretty much getting close to the end of the war. During that same time, Grant keeps attacking Robert E. Lee's army. They keep going backwards and backwards and backwards. Eventually, they end up in a small town called Appomattox, okay? It's a very small town. There's not much Southern Army left. Robert E. Lee knows that if they keep fighting, his army will get slaughtered in that small town. So eventually, he just surrenders. He said, enough is enough. We can't win. I don't want any more people to die. That is it. Okay, so in the Appomattox Courthouse, which is a famous building, okay, famous landmark in the United States history, Robert E. Lee surrenders the Southern Army, the Confederate Army, to Ulysses S. Grant. Now, when he surrenders, Grant gives him actually really good surrender conditions. Okay, Grant tells him that even though you have to turn in your rifles, officers get to keep their pistols. If soldiers have horses, keep them because you guys are going to need them to do that farming. Okay, in the spring, keep your horses. Okay, and he also says that the soldiers just get to leave. The North is not going to arrest them. They're not going to try and hunt them down. Just leave. You guys are free to go. Okay, so Robert E. Lee signs the paper. The Northern soldiers start cheering immediately, right? You just won the war. They're cheering. Grant tells them to stop. He says, don't cheer. Those people that we just defeated are now your countrymen again, which means they're part of the same country. You shouldn't be cheering for beating people for the same country that you live in. Okay, so he's trying to keep them humble and not rub it in the South's face that they just lost. Okay, he knows that their life is changing tremendously, that they just lost the war, so he's trying to not rub it in. Okay, and not have his soldiers rub it in. Because the South lost, of course, Lincoln's rules go into effect down there. Slavery is now illegal. Okay, so we're starting a new chapter of freedom. African Americans and all those slaves are now going to be legally free. Now, of course, as soon as the war ends, are all African Americans just, boom, free, you walk away? Probably not, right? People are still going to fight that, and there's going to be all kinds of problems. But according to the law, African Americans are now free, which is a huge step in American history at that time. Okay, and the nation begins a new chapter because of that freedom. And also now we have to try and heal all those wounds that happened because of the Civil War, all that money that got spent, all the lives lost. Okay, all has to be fixed, or at least try to fix. Obviously, you cannot fix when lives are lost, and that's a huge loss for the country at this time. So they have to do their best to try and mend these wounds together and come back together as one strong country. All right. That's pretty much all I have for Chapter 8. If you have questions about anything that I've talked about, please email me and let me know, or get a time to talk with me one-on-one. Make sure you've turned in all your previous assignments. I am missing a ton of assignments from some of you. Please make sure you're turning that stuff in. Remember, I am giving grades on it, and you do get graded on this quarter. Okay? Look at PowerSchool, check your email, be a responsible student, and let me know if you have any questions. I hope you're staying healthy, and I hope you have a great day.